Fellows of the Academy, guests, colleagues, friends, welcome to our 2026 annual lecture. And for those who don't know, I'm Will Hutton, I'm the Academy's president, and it's my pleasure to chair the lecture this evening and introduce our speaker, Professor Rana. But a bit of penance beforehand. It's a brilliant kind of lecture. You're just going to have to put up with me for a few minutes. I want to say a few words about the Academy, update you. It's not going to take long, and let's hope that England score during the course of the... Our fellows are at the heart of all we do. It's great to have in the audience some of our distinguished honorary fellows, and they're going to be, at the end, there'll be a little ceremony where we kind of give them their honorary fellowship. I'm also delighted to see some of our new fellows present, and some of the founding fellows and leaders of the Academy in the past. Guess what? We've now got 1,750 fellows. That's not a trivial number. It spans the complete breadth of the social sciences, and it's drawn from academia, public, private, and the third sectors. And what's as important is that fellows are really growing ever more involved in our work, so thanks to you all. Now, everyone in the room knows that social science is both under incredible pressure, witness the redundancies spreading across the university sector, but simultaneously never more necessary given the kind of issues the country seeks to address, and what the Burnham government has kind of, I'm preempting what's going to happen in 2 or 3 weeks' time. I'm imagining that Al Khan's is not going to stand, actually, the last man not to stand. It's a kind of dilemma. But we're focused at the Academy on our charitable purpose of promoting the social sciences for the public benefit in the UK. And over the last 5-6 years, since I've been president and a little bit beforehand, it's been a period of substantial strategic development and growth in our work. We're now in a better position than ever, and arguably more needed than ever, to champion the many benefits of having a thriving and diverse social science sector within our higher education institutions and our schools, and evolving, I stress, vocational training. We are actually a social science nation. I sometimes talk about Britain being an innovation nation, but we're a social science nation. We're one of the leaders, world leaders in world research. We train roughly half the graduates entering the workforce in the UK, half the graduates entering the workforce in the UK. We play a leadership role in the civic agencies of many universities in England and the devolved nations. And social science can provide evidence and constructive challenge for policymakers here and internationally. Needs saying, I think. I know we're amongst friends, but it should be said. Now, everyone, doubtless, was kind of attentively watching Andy Burnham on Monday, setting out his agenda for number 10 North, promoting regeneration, better public utilities and reindustrialization. And what caught my eye, actually, and which I was surprised that more people didn't catch it, was not just that, but a reference that I know from talking to him in the past that he takes this particular point very seriously. The German Constitution's Article 107 on a basic law, it's part of the basic law, Article 107, stressing that every lander in Germany should have exactly equivalent public resource available to it with all the transfers that entails. And he means to introduce that in the UK. And for me, when I watched the press comment, I thought, why aren't people talking about that? But we are. We've been, one of the things that we've been doing at the Academy is actually focusing on just that, regional growth and regional equality. So we published a report with 8 Midlands universities last September, showcasing how their social science research and leadership was deeply and effectively engaged in supporting growth and kind of productivity in the Midlands. Then came Contemporary Relevance of Social Science. We published that in November, and that showed how social science contributes to major agendas in the UK and devolved nations and regions. And that was published as part of the campaign's annual SAGE report. It's SAGE who are a major commercial sponsor. So, you know, you use the annual lecture to give a kind of tribute to SAGE. Thank you very much, SAGE. Enhancing the Evidence Ecosystem was published in December, and that was the product of a research program exploring if and how the evidence infrastructure and processes in Whitehall could be enhanced to improve the policy outcomes for government and citizens. And so that kind of, underneath that kind of slightly kind of bland kind of sentence sits kind of some really kind of nitty-gritty objectives, try to get kind of social science properly represented kind of within officialdom, within departments, kind of in a way that hasn't been hitherto. Whether it's industrial strategy sectors, whether it's those 3 reports, we're kind of storming along. I'm going to use the adjective, not an adjective, it's an adverb. It's not even an adverb, it's a verb. Storming along, trying to raise the salience of these issues. The academic journal, Contemporary Social Science, has forthcoming special issues on civic universities and on place leadership. So if you want to learn more about it all, do visit our website. And of course, there's the podcast on which Rana featured, a brilliant podcast. And one of our new honorary fellows, Philippe Aguillon, figured, the We Society podcast. She's doing bloody well, actually. Close to 500,000 cumulative listenership. A thriving events program in the Campaign for Leadership, and I work with 48 member learner societies. So, have a look at the annual report and have some pride, actually. You know, and Rita and team have done a fantastic job. Now, that's enough of that. I don't think England has scored. But addressed to Rana. It's fantastic to welcome him here, actually. I really kind of, when I first encountered him kind of properly on the podcast, I was drawn to his kind of, the balance he strikes. You'll hear it. And he kind of actually thinks independently kind of the consensus. OBE, FBA, a most distinguished historian and political scientist. He specializes in modern Chinese history and the author of 4 acclaimed books and lots of papers. He holds the St. Lee Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, and following a career at Oxford University, where he's president of the History and Politics of Modern China at the Department of Politics and International Relations, director of Oxford's China Centre, and a fellow and vice master of St. Cross. He shared the burden of running an Oxford College for a bit, which I did for 9 years, so congratulations. This evening, he draws on his research to speak about how China's relations with the world will be shaped by factors from the past, present, and future. He will consider how the world may change, how Europe might react in an era when the leaders of the US and China are seeking to change the global order in kind of new, unpredictable kind of directions, and not actually kind of in the same direction. At the end, there'll be time for questions. And then the final formal activity before we move to do a bit of networking, drinking, and all the rest will be the celebration of the Academy's 2026 Honorary Fellows. So thank you very much for coming. I give you Rana Mitter.
Well, Mr. President, thank you so much for a very, very kind welcome. Just making sure, amongst other things, I can be heard at the back and indeed at the front. Good. Okay, we'll throw something from the back row if I become inaudible. I mean, I am delighted to be giving this lecture at a time when we are in the middle of one of the fiercest and most important geopolitical contest that has existed in world history. And I understand that England is still one goal down in terms of DRC versus England, but nonetheless, we might talk also a little bit about the US and China, I suppose, as well. It's also a huge pleasure to have the honour of being the Academy's 2026 lecturer. I know that you've had a variety of very distinguished speakers over the years. Well, I think you've done it yourself, have you not, on one?
I have done one, yep.
Occasion.
Yep,
Absolutely. I know also Mariana Mazzucato did it last year, and of course there is a sort of moment appearing in British politics when perhaps a whole variety of your previous lecturers may be called to service. So who knows? Just say, Andy, I'm available if there's any need for input on China and other matters. In fact, I think Jim O'Neill, a man who certainly knows China, is also in the circle of people who have interesting things to say to what I think we still technically call the putative Prime Minister and his plans for the future. So maybe that will be part of, well, maybe a speaker for your next annual lecture there, assuming that Jim O'Neill is not taken up with other things. What I'd like to do tonight, also, as I say, to thank the Academy, to thank Will, to thank Rita, Gardner, and many others who made this event possible, but also to thank all of you for coming here, not just because you'll have to consult your phones discreetly about the score while I talk about China, but also on what I know is a hot afternoon during a very busy time of year. I really do appreciate your coming to spend a bit of time here, and I hope that even if, as I say, my comments may not be sufficient compensation, there are drinks afterwards, I believe, so there'll be something here for everyone. And I think that it is certainly the case that we are listening, we are talking today about the US-China relationship and its connections with Europe at a genuinely geopolitically very, very consequential time. I think, literally this morning, I think we got the news that Chinese representatives, including I think a Vice Premier, are here in London at the moment talking about the UK-China trade relationship. That's not obviously something that comes out of nowhere. There's been a long relationship for a while, but nonetheless, the feeling that this is now part of a wider mixture of things the UK is doing in terms of its new economic direction is inevitably in the air. But that, one has to say, sits as part of a much wider set of geopolitical shifts. And it's some of those that I want to get to in terms of the sort of exam questions, so to speak. We're in June, so I suppose exam questions are on the minds of many of us, except those of us who've moved to the United States, we get all our marking done by May, I have to say, which is why we're allowed out of the house to come and give lectures after that. For those who are still on exam boards at the moment, I offer you my commiserations. It wasn't so long ago since I remember having to spend much of June in hot rooms dealing with absolutely impenetrable handwriting, so no doubt that particular pleasure still remains. We are speaking, I think, also at a moment when it's clear that there is a reset, a very significant reset, I think, and I'll go into some of the reasons why I think that's happening during the course of the talk I'm giving today, in the US-China relationship. And I think that there is an argument, more than happy to discuss afterwards, Will, to say that the US-China relationship has for some time, and will be for quite some time to come, the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world today. That may be true in terms of issues of traditional military security. It may be true in terms of areas to do with culture, ideology. I think it's increasingly true in the area of technology, which I think is where a lot of what we may discuss this evening actually relates to. But it also relates, perhaps at this moment more than any other in recent years, to personalities as well. And I know this is an Academy of Social Science, and since my presentation, I apologize for this right up front, it has one graph in it, but it essentially has no maths. So whether I'm allowed to be here under false pretenses, Will, I couldn't say. There may be some anthropologists in the room who will save me, since I think you guys don't do so much maths either, just like us historians. But I think that the politics of personality have not traditionally been at the forefront of at least some of the areas of fruitful political science analysis, where trends and wider issues have often overcome the examination of personality. Not completely, I know, of course, but nonetheless. But I think that looking at these two gentlemen here, President Donald Trump, President Xi Jinping, of course, we can see that there is a moment at which the decisions of individuals, very powerful individuals, of course, in this case, are making a significant difference in a whole variety of different areas. And again, if we're taking a mnemonic away with us today, I'll go with the 3 T's, all of which I'll try and mention at least at some point during the talk. One is tariffs and trade, so that's kind of 2 T's really. The second is Taiwan, and the third is technology. And all of those, I think, have some relevance in terms of the interpersonal relationship between Trump and Xi. They operate, of course, in the context of a very, very fast-shifting geopolitical environment. And although it's somewhat head-spinning to think about it, the images, all of which I'm sure you'll recognize on this, this picture here, all relate only to the first half of this year. So it's 1st of July as we speak, and this is for the recording as well. As of the time we speak, apart from England not having scored, I'm not aware that Cuba has been invaded, but it may be that there will be an additional picture that emerges here. But even for the first 6 months of the year, this is, how can one put it, quite the agenda. We started all the way back in January, a whole 6 months ago, with the rendition of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. We then have the Greenland caper, if that's the right way to put it. I don't think the Danes thought it was very funny, but nonetheless. And of course, ongoing now, the Iran war, which of course is kind of a sort of Schrödingerian war at the moment. It may be resolved or it may not be resolved, both at the same time as it appears. Although, as I'm sure you'll be aware, the gentleman on the left, sorry to disappoint you, Will, but he will not be available for next year's Academy of Social Science lecture. You'll have to look elsewhere for that. And the present, you know, the shifts in Venezuela, Greenland, Iran in terms of geopolitics, of course, are not necessarily directly to do with China, but have hugely changed the geopolitical environment in which China operates. And I'll say more about that in just a second. Before I do that, though, I'm going to do my best. I guess this is the Academy of Social Sciences. If I can't give you some maths or too many graphs, I can give you a framework. And here's the framework that I would like to put forward. The idea of what I call competitive anti-liberalism. And this is based on 2 premises, or at least probably more than 2, but 2 that I want to put up here for consideration. The first, both of them contentious, by the way, so again, feel free to push back in the Q&A. The first time in over 100 years, the 2 global hegemons, and yes, I know IR theorists say you can't have more than one hegemon, but bear with me for a moment. 2 global hegemons both reject liberalism and seek a new non-liberal order. And then, as a function of that, it seems to me already we can see that this will, or indeed is, and has affected many mainstream liberal ideas. And I use the word liberal in both a specific but actually quite broadly defined sense, including ideas of rule of law, free trade in particular, and ideas of the individuated liberal subject as the center of society, the center of civil society, and in particular, the agent of human flourishing. This may not seem, at least to some, a particularly controversial way of defining what liberal subjectivity is, but I would suggest that both in terms of the way in which the current Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and the way in which what's become the MAGA settlement are operating, that actually those ideas, along with ideas such as free trade, are no longer part of any kind of broad liberal mainstream, and even more than that, both China and the US, at the moment, admittedly on the basis of entirely different premises, reject those liberal norms. Technically, China does embrace free trade as a phraseology, but I think most economists here, I think we have some economists in the room, would suggest that in practice, China is a highly mercantilist economy and puts up lots of non-tariff barriers in terms of trade into China itself. In the case of the United States, as I think you will all be aware, tariff barriers of a very old-fashioned sort are very much back in fashion. And although Robert Lighthizer is not current US trade representative, his protege, Jameson Greer, is, Robert Lighthizer wrote a book literally with the title No Trade is Free, giving you some idea of what he thinks about conventional liberal economics. So this idea that you actually have two, not just non-liberal, not even illiberal, but anti-liberal hegemons, both of whom regard liberalism in the broad sense as the problem that needs to be solved, as opposed to a tool to getting to a better world, is, I think, pretty unprecedented, at least in the late modern era, certainly since the early 20th century. And that competitive anti-liberalism, shared premises in many areas, but also a strong feeling that the US and China are the two players who need to outdo each other in terms of a global competition, I think is, well, to use a good Marxist term, a contradiction that is currently being worked through in a way that Hegel, is he an honorary fellow of the Academy? Well, get his certificate soon. That Hegel would rather have appreciated had he been able to join us today. Actually, of course, Hegel was very keen on Geist, so he may well be with us today in some spiritual fashion. If you have any interest in exploring the competitive anti-liberalism idea a bit more, this chapter is available for free download. So no trade is free, but academic articles are, at least on occasion, from the Johns Hopkins University website in this book with the Ronseal title, Lessons from the New Cold War, edited by Hal Brands of Johns Hopkins University. So let me move on from that, but leave you with that, not leave you, but ask you to keep in mind that, that framing in terms of some of the specific policy areas that I think we are now seeing explored through this lens of competitive anti-liberalism. And I think the first, and perhaps in some ways the most immediately relevant, are two of those T's, trade and technology. So both sides are very keen to boost their economies. This may be the least surprising statement that will come in the entire lecture, it must be said, nor are the US and China particularly unique in that aim, but nonetheless, it remains key, I think, key to understanding both that if you were to have one abiding central thesis to the political economy of both countries at the moment, trying to find ways to essentially boost growth, I think, is the case in both Beijing and in Washington. And much of that growth they see through the lens of technology in the widest sense. We have come to talk about technology as being AI, above all else, and I'm delighted that amongst others, Dr. Stephanie Hare, the co-presenter of BBC News Channel's AI Decoded, is with us in the company today, so I'm expecting you later on to explain to us how it all works, Steph. That will be great. But as well as that, areas such as green tech in particular, post-fossil fuel energy, and again, delighted that Isabel Hilton, who knows much more than I will ever do about this subject, is with us, and I hope to hear your thoughts about that later as well. 5G, anyone who has ever heard the name Huawei, which I suspect is many people in this room, will know how politically controversial, but certainly also technologically central, the rollout of that 5G technology has been in terms of promoting China's tech influence. And biotech, until recently, I think maybe almost the, if not forgotten, at least underplayed part of that technological development. But I think it was not coincidental by any means that when Keir Starmer visited Beijing a million years ago, in fact also 6 months ago in January, he took with him not one but two CEOs of pharmaceutical firms, a sign of where at least some of the UK's geopolitical advantage, or geoeconomic advantage as well as geopolitical advantage, clearly lies. And in some ways, the search for superiority in all of these technologies and more has become both part of a search for global influence, but also, and not incompatibly, about the idea of the provision of global public goods as well. And that relates in particular, I think, actually to energy transition, which we'll come back to, but where China is, at least at the moment, creating a narrative of much greater success than it might even have dreamed of just a few years ago. Let me also say a couple of words about what I think what I think is the overall goal or purpose that China has in mind as it seeks to become part of that globally, anti-liberally competitive world. And that is, I would say, and again, this is very broad brush here, but I would say that China's aim is to be the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. In terms of its own self-definition, of its current national mission as being a great renaissance of the Chinese people, the phrase 大复兴 is being used frequently in this context. This means that within its own Asia-Pacific region, in some ways, China, or at least as defined by the leading party, is choosing to restore a pre-existing form of eminence in the region which existed for 2,000 years or more, but which happens to have gone abeyance during the period of 150 to 200 years of Western imperial dominance in East Asia, which it's now, in this model, is coming to an end. Beyond that, it also has a strong interest in global influence, as I've suggested just now. I think the largest part of that global influence by miles at the moment is economic. The Belt and Road Initiative is one very obvious brand name manifestation of that influence, now being largely replaced actually by GDI, the Global Development Initiative, which is part of a suite of global influence initiatives: Global Development Initiative, Global Civilizational Initiative, Global Governance Initiative, and last but by no means least, Global Security Initiative, all of which interact in terms of a world model that China is seeking to develop and promote. And the use of investment and finance capital is a significant part of that, not least in the emerging markets of sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Not by any means in a one-way direction. Again, there'll be many opinions in this room, but I'll put it out there. I think some of the often quite simplistic stories about Chinese debt diplomacy are very one-dimensional in terms of understanding how actually the interaction between many of these emerging markets and Chinese finance is actually much more complex, and we can talk about that, I hope, a little later on. But it would also be remiss not to mention the other element which China undoubtedly has, which is a growing level of military power and capability for projection. Conversions of dollar amounts are not always entirely helpful, but nonetheless, China has the second biggest military budget in the world after the United States, around 188 billion US dollars in a direct conversion. Obviously, a US dollar will buy you much more in terms of labor costs and procurement in China than it might do in the United States. But nonetheless, the indication of something of that size can also be understood in terms of capacity that China has today that it simply couldn't have dreamed of, and nor could the rest of the world, 20 or 30 years ago. Blue water naval projection into the Indian Ocean and beyond. Space technology, of course, very notably, and also tremendous capacity to use AI in terms of autonomous weaponry. One thing that has been relatively weak is what my brilliant and much missed old colleague at the Kennedy School, Joe Nye, would have did call soft power, a term which again I think in a room full of social scientists I don't need to expand on too much. We always used to say when going to China that in the old days China looked for wisdom to Zhou Enlai, and we used to look to Zhou S. Nye, so it was nearly the same thing. We do miss him very much, but his ideas live on. In the present moment, and again, I don't know how many of you, either on your own phones or perhaps the phones of your teenage children, have seen recently the meme, the phrase, "You meet me at a very Chinese time of my life." But if that, yes, a sort of couple of smiles of recognition there. The China maxing trend, which may be a short-lived thing that disappears, but nonetheless, that has provided a sort of softer, more kind of accessible means of understanding a Chinese vibe, has been, at least the last few months, going pretty big in various parts of certainly Western European and North American youth culture. And so even an area where China's traditionally, because of its highly authoritarian governmental culture, not been particularly successful in soft power, may be changing a bit. One of the, from my point of view, frankly slightly depressing reasons that may also be true is that you will all be aware by now we are living in an era when authoritarianism globally is rather more acceptable and even to some rather more glamorous than it used to be as well. And glamour and soft power, of course, are very closely linked as well. All of this goes by way of providing one way of keeping score if we are thinking about that geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And this is in in that context, well-known term, 综合国力, comprehensive national power, which is essentially a kind of index score of military power, economic power, and even areas like cultural power, in which different countries are rated against each other. And China has been slowly but surely, or steadily rather than slowly, I'd say, quite fast in some cases, moving up the comparability lists. Second, still in many cases, still to the United States, but second to few other countries in the world. So there you have a few framings of the ways in which I think we should understand China's changing role in the world and how it engages with some of those international issues. And as I say, we'll go into some of those in just a bit more detail. Before we do that, though, I need to take not a detour, but a sort of a hot click or a sidebar for a couple of minutes to add one other element. And that's this. Because one thing that I think it's worth noting, and a few of you who may have read a piece I had in Foreign Affairs last year will have seen some mention of this, so if it's a repeat, I apologize, but it's worth saying. With China, past performance is no guarantee of the future. Or rather, let me put it a different way. Each of these pictures represents an important historical moment in China's relationship with the world over the last 100 to 120 years. And in each case, if you are a responsible, well-sourced analyst using the best information you have, a social scientist, let's say, and you extrapolated from the evidence you had at that point what would seem a likely projection 5, 10, 20 years into the future, I would bet that in every single case you would have got it wrong. So at the top there, in 1904 or 5, when the Dowager Empress Cixi was sitting on the behind the throne, actually technically not on the throne, but with various foreign visitors. Not that people could see change was coming, but not many people thought that 20 years hence China would actually be a republic where the 2,000-year-old imperial system had broken down and would also be a sort of troubled country split between various warlords, all of whom were fighting each other. Off the back of that, 20 years later, very few people would have imagined this scene, where the leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader at that time, met in Cairo, this is in fact in Egypt, with the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, along with the indispensable Sung Mei-ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, his English-speaking, Wellesley College-educated messenger to the world, with China basically setting out on its path to global top-table significance as a full wartime ally against the Axis powers, and of course getting set for that permanent seat at the UN Security Council just a couple of years later as the war came to an end. And as Chiang Kai-shek, settled in for the idea that he would be part of that post-war settlement, very few people would have guessed that within 5 years, in fact, to the end of the war, he wouldn't be in power at all. He'd be off on the island of Taiwan in exile, never to return. And instead, Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong, would have won a victory for his Communist Party and formed an alliance with no less than Generalissimo Stalin to create a Sino-Soviet pact. And if you saw that in 1950, very, very few people in the West guessed that just 10 years later, the Soviets and the Chinese Communist Party would have fallen out massively with a huge row between Mao and Khrushchev, leading to a long-standing suspicion amongst the Western world that somehow the communist powers were actually trying to fool the West, not realizing for a very long time that the split was real and very deadly between these huge communist powers. And then, with all of the history that comes in between that, to take just the one we have here, the signatories, China signing its entry to the World Trade Organization, WTO, in November of 2001 in Doha, in Qatar, looked on by various American supporters at this time. No one, I think, looking at that signing ceremony, which may in retrospect have been the last time, I'm going to be quite specific about this, the last time that the US and China shared a geopolitical policy goal which was then brought to fruition. So they did share some goals later on climate change, but those, surprise, surprise, haven't actually worked out terribly well so far. And since then, there is almost no geopolitical goal that China and the US have shared agreement on and essentially worked on together. So this didn't mark, as many people thought, the beginning of a period of new cooperation. It actually marked, in some senses, the end of an era and the beginning of what became, 25 years later, in our present day, actually essentially a trade war between the two sides, which is certainly not what either side, I think, were expecting when they signed that agreement in Doha. In other words, it is an incredibly dangerous game to try and take any present-day moment and extrapolate what China is going to do 5, 10, 20 years into the future. It's a fool's errand, which is why that's exactly what I'm going to try and do in the remaining 10 minutes or so of the talk. Just giving you the health warning right there, so you can't say I didn't warn you. So, despite the difficulty of making specific predictions, and I will be foolish enough to do that near the end, but I'm, as I say, warning you that they may well be entirely hollow. But one thing I will stand by is that I think the underlying bases of how China is shaping political thinking actually are quite definable and remain pretty long-standing. The difference, perhaps, again, between climate and weather, the particular events are weather, this is climate. So the first thing that shapes that climate is that very long, traumatic modern history. Probably from the point of view of, again, many people here I know grew up in China, so feel free again to tell me if I'm wrong a little later on. But essentially starting with the Opium Wars of the 1830s, the kind of forced opening of the door of China by imperial Western powers, particularly the British and the French at first, ending perhaps with 1945 and the end of the defeat of Japan at the end of World War II, and then, of course, the communist victory in 1949. So that period of modern history, a century when China was essentially on the back foot, still lives in collective social memory, even, of course, very few people are literally alive from that period, although some are. So that is one shaping element. And again, if you think about it, it's very different from the experience of, let's say, the United States, which then and now is protected by two large oceans and a very strong sense of always being on the front foot in terms of its national destiny, or at least until very, very recently. The Trump administration has taken a rather different tack on that, but even they are talking about, of course, making America great again, and so that is perhaps in that direction. Second one, perhaps the simplest to talk about, is economic legitimacy, the way in which, particularly in the reform era since the 1970s, China has essentially put forward the idea of an economic social contract in which standards of living improve as part of its offer, not just to its own population, but to the wider world, at the same time also highly restricting individual civil liberties and personal political choices as part of it. The third one is pre-modern thought, and I'm using that as a sort of catch-all to talk about what's sometimes called Confucianism, but Confucianism plus. Confucius, I'm sure you're aware, of course, the archetypal Chinese political and ethical thinker, more than 2,500 years ago that he lived, with his ideas of hierarchy, harmony, and perhaps above anything else, ritual, the correct way of doing things as a way of ordering society. This is, in a sense, an anomaly, because 100 years ago, during the May 4th movement, which one of our colleagues here from, I think, UCL mentioned, apparently I talked about sort of 15 years ago or something when I came to UCL, so apologies for bringing it up again, but 15-year gap is not too bad, I think. The May 4th movement, the nationalist movement of the early 20th century, around the 1910s, actively rejected that Confucian past and regarded it as feudal, backward, and damaging. So for the Chinese Communist Party, which emerged from that period, to re-embrace Confucianism as a way of thinking, and also Taoism and other pre-modern philosophies, is something of a significant shift. And then finally, last but by no means least, Marxism-Leninism, the continued use of those ideas which draw from Hegel, from Marx, many of which Mao himself wrote and theorized, are still widely discussed, not least in theoretical journals such as Qiushi, the theoretical journal of the Chinese Communist Party itself, Seeking Truth, and as its title. And for those who find that perhaps reading copies of 旧事 a little bit dull, there have also been popular culture attempts to try and deal with many of the contradictions in thought that emerge from that rather kind of grab bag of different political influences that you have there, particularly the last two, the Confucian and the Marxist sort. Some of you may have seen the TV series that was broadcast on Hunan TV in China under the title When Marx Met Confucius. And this was in 5 parts in which 2 actors with, I have to say, flagrantly false beards sat and engaged in dialogue about whether or not Marxism is or is not compatible with Confucian thinking. At one point, the Karl Marx character, Karl Marx in this voice, says to Confucius, "You know, I always felt a little bit Chinese," which I have to say is not a sentence that I remember appearing in the Grundrisse, but maybe it's there somewhere if you look hard enough. In the end, and I don't want to spoil the ending if you will, but I will, if you get to the end of episode 5, the answer is you can reconcile these 2 things if you put them together as part of the Argetieche, the second recombination under Xi Jinping thought. So in case you're wondering, that's the way in which you do it. And all kind of pop culture elements apart, the fact that such a show was put on Chinese TV, I have to say it was not very well received by the Chinese internet public, social media public, who regarded it as a bit simplistic and quite glib. But nonetheless, shows that the issue of thinking about how you reconcile these seemingly incompatible modes of ideological thinking, a radical revolutionary strand, that is Marxism-Leninism, and one that is essentially more hierarchical and more settled on order, which of course is Confucianism, has been a problem for 150 years or so, ever since the late Qing dynasty, and continues to be so in the present day. Meanwhile, public policy operates in that ideological context, but with a lot more that is clearly urgent in the here and now. The summit that was just held between Xi and Trump in May of this year, just a little more than a month ago, was amongst other things, of course, based on the increasing outrage of the current US administration, but not just them, it's true under Biden and others as well, in terms of the huge trade deficit which the United States has with China. And this bar chart, you don't need too much explanation to see why, value in billions of US dollars, this caused the Trump administration to want a reset. Whether that happens or not, we will see. It also relates to what I think are beyond that. I mean, again, the trade deficit won't be solved by some of the agreements that seem to have been inked during that summit, but they'll do, there'll be short-term sticking plaster, what some people call the 3 Bs, which is more sale of beans, as in Midwestern soybeans, beef from Montana and other cattle ranching states, and Boeings, which are grown, I believe, in the gardens of Seattle and sent out to China for their airlines. But broadly speaking, these more structural issues are still at the heart of the US-China relationship, the China-Western relationship, and the China relationship with much of the rest of the world, including the global south. Supply chains. I mean, again, the decoupling debate to this audience, I think, will be familiar. It is by no means resolved. And in fact, this term about decoupling from China's economy has really gone out of fashion, I'd say, in the last year or two, because the realization that removing China from essentially all supply chains is an almost impossible task in the near future. So the term de-risking, which is originally a European term, but is now used more by the Americans as well, has become more evident. But even there, the dominance that China has developed over years and decades in a whole variety of areas that are central to the world economy will not be easily unpicked. Talent pool and IP, intellectual property. This is one that I think, again, has a huge amount of relevance in terms of what's happening now and where things will go. I'm going to summarize far too crudely, but possibly helpfully. Right now, in terms of the US-China competition, the main problem is that it's very, very difficult getting scientifically highly talented people into the United States, and it's very difficult getting talented scientific people out of China. In other words, the US is making it harder and harder for people to essentially come and take some of those tech jobs, which were traditionally a source of high-skilled immigrant labor. And the aim there is to try and indigenize more of that labor there as well. But whether that will work out, we have to see. But for the moment, we've seen that migration rates into the United States have significantly dropped in the last year. In the case of China, most of the talent that's gone into China has been often Chinese-related, but going back to China for a kind of further career. But the case, of course, of the Manus executives who wanted to move their startup from China to Singapore and have now been placed essentially under not arrest, but certainly a no-exit visa ban, shows that in some cases the Chinese state is now pushing security over the mobility of talent. And I think these two circumstances are beginning to mean that other actors, could be the European Union, could be the emergent global south science, kind of not superpowers, but certainly emerging powers, the Malaysias, the Singapores, the Brazils, who may have more of a role there. Third one, we've mentioned, and we'll just say it again, energy crisis versus green economy. Everyone wants lots and lots of energy, not least because they want to build huge data centers in which to develop, sort of power the amount of compute they need to run AI. To do that, you need lots and lots of energy, but if you have lots and lots of fossil fuel energy, you will make climate change even worse. Until recently, the previous US administration, the Biden administration, was attempting to solve this on their part with a kind of industrial, Inflation Reduction Act, Green New Deal. That's now been abandoned by the Trump administration, who've gone all in for fossil fuels. Meanwhile, China is now becoming the dominant player on the core question of how countries can both develop their tech economies, keep their middle-class voting publics happy, which China doesn't have voting, but all the countries it deals with pretty much do, while also not exacerbating climate change. And then the wider question of whether or not FDI and investment as a whole, perhaps being discussed in London literally today, is politically sensitive to the point where Chinese investment is no longer possible, or whether or not it is still possible in an environment where the very real security risks of dealing with China, particularly in areas like high tech, can't be ignored. Meanwhile, I will focus in for a second on that green energy piece, because I think that if we're trying to look at where things are going in the next 3, 5, 10 years, as I just said, that's entirely a fool's errand, but indulge the fool here. I think that green energy is becoming more and more the moral narrative on which China is going to project its international image. People sometimes ask, is China going to spread communism or Confucianism around the world? And the answer is no, it's not. I don't think it would take in that way. That's a different question, I think, from a more interesting one, which is China going to be able to spread a narrative about itself that, at least in its own terms, has moral weight to it? I think that, despite the authoritarian shift, the idea that the rest of the world will necessarily, have great love for an authoritarian single-party state that is, basically pushing back against civil rights and civil liberties is not a very easily saleable model. Instead, green energy, essentially saving the planet, I think is going to be much more part of what China is looking to project to the world. And at home already, the term 生态文明, ecological civilization is the usual translation, I think, is being pushed at home as the idea of a sort of green, authoritarian social contract that is necessary, A, to mitigate climate change, B, to create a kind of more prosperous middle-class society, and C, to give a sort of moral ballast underpinning society, will also become part, I think, of the global message that China puts out there. It will do so, though, in a context where China's message will not be uncontested any more than the United States' message will be uncontested either. And in that context, I would point to, first of all, the rise of the middle powers. This is a term which, having essentially been a little bit in geopolitical abeyance in the last few years, has been revitalized not least by Mark Carney's speech at Davos a little earlier in the year. I don't think I saw you at Davos this year, Will, but that was mainly because I wasn't invited. But maybe you. Mark Carney's speech at Davos essentially put forward this idea that the emerging economies, obviously Canada would fit in the kind of first world examples, if you want all global north examples, but certainly in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, should take a much more active role in shaping global governance, standards, and institutions. And this we've done in the context of navigating between the US and China. Broadly speaking, even in its current incarnation, when given a choice, most of these powers will, perhaps reluctantly, but nonetheless, navigate towards the US as a security partner. And we see that in Asia, when Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, and others continue in some ways to stress the relationship with Asian partners, such as Singapore, South Korea, and so forth, continues to be strong. But the reality is that China is, of course, now a key trade partner for almost all of those actors as well, and that's a balance that needs to be made. And within that, again, going for a prediction here, I think that part of the way in which the middle powers will seek more and more to navigate through the trap of potentially being caught between the US and China, particularly in terms of what increasingly has been called the tech curtain, the idea that you can only exist in a Chinese or American tech environment, is to be seeking to become major science and innovation powers in their own right. This is not cheap, it's not easy, but don't forget that very few people, perhaps Will was one of the exceptions, I think he probably were actually, 20, 25 years ago, very few people would have predicted that China would become essentially the second biggest science superpower in the world. To do it amongst a constellation of often very dissimilar powers will be an even harder task, but hard is not the same thing as impossible. And there is, of course, one actor that could, if it chose to get up off the sofa, have a significant role in this, which is, of course, Europe, another subject on which obviously you've also written rather extensively and insightfully, Will. In other words, we are right now in a moment when the question of what is Europe, how is it going to define itself in terms of that increasing US-China division is a debate of great urgency. Self-sufficiency, technology, defense, all of these, as well as, of course, the Chinese relationship as well as with Russia as part of the security element, is part of a live debate. And again, there'll be other people here who are more expert than I am in terms of why that matters. But suffice it to say at the moment that technology is now at the heart of that decision. And for Europe, the question of whether or not it can develop its own tech environment, not just one within its bubble that is purely defensive, but whether it can actually be a genuine exporter of that technology in a universe where the US and China are not the only actors. That, of course, becomes urgent in another context where both geopolitics and technology matter, which is Taiwan. Taiwan was the third T, or the second T, depending on which way you look at it, in the US-China relationship, what has been for decades and decades. It wasn't mentioned all that much in the summit between the two sides, but it's worth noting that the American signals on Taiwan have been that some of the language has changed. In particular, I think a continuing and growing sense from the American side that they want Taiwan to be aware that an unquestioning American support for the island may no longer be possible, along with actually, unlike the statements on Europe and NATO, unlike that, a strong feeling that the basic policy is still very much in place. The Department of Defense, or Department of War, as it's now called by its secretary, and the State Department, still advocate a highly defensive posture for Taiwan. And arms sales and other elements of Taiwan's self-defense still continue to be part of that mixture, along with the AUKUS initiative, Australia, United Kingdom, United States, working on nuclear-powered submarines, amongst other things, still continue, despite some wobbles, to be supported in Washington. So that question is one that, again, is geopolitically going to be very significant coming up to the 2028 presidential election, presidential election in Taiwan, I should say, where the possibility of a more pro-China candidate, the KMT chairwoman Zheng Liwen, is concentrating minds on all sides, not least in Beijing. But Taiwan itself will continue to be, I think, a contentious point between the two. As I mentioned before, just briefly here, some examples of how China is beginning, I think, to try and influence some of those separate global South science initiatives with Brazil, with Brazil on biotech, with the UAE on space technology, with Singapore on AI. As I've said, the way to think about this, I think, is not just as China getting in early to provide some kind of tech path dependency, but also as middle power actors who are seeking more agency and autonomy and would like to use both US and Chinese science capacity, whether it's in training human capital or whether it's in terms of technology, software, IP, to create their own science environment. And let me use that to go to my last slide, which is where I'll leave us in terms of opening up discussion, Will, which is the danger, the danger point, the prediction, 20 years hence. So with the proviso that all of this could go the way of that picture of Stalin and Mao smiling at each other and then dissolving into recriminations, here are some things that I think we should be looking out for in the next few years and even decades. I think that the path dependency on different sources of energy, which has been particularly triggered by the Trump administration moving away from the Biden Green New Deal, is going to be hard to reverse now. It's both literally and metaphorically hard to turn supertankers around. And the infrastructure that you need to develop the green economy, a green energy transition, is now very firmly, it seems to me, oriented towards China. It doesn't mean that Europe and other actors couldn't have a role, but that divergence strikes me as being something that is going to continue for quite some time. Likewise, the science research environments, I think, are going to continue to diverge as well. There will be some cooperation between the two sides, but China is doubling down on what some have called security logic in terms of its most sensitive technology. You will not get into the top Chinese AI development areas unless you have very high security clearance. The same will be more and more true in the United States. This means that people, I mean, again, we've just seen what's been happening with Mythos, Fable, and so forth, with the US being able to turn on and turn off access to those products. That will, I think, lead to an increasing urgency in Europe and elsewhere to have technology that is not simply subject to the whim of one superpower or another. I think we will also see a wider global influence of this wider Chinese ideology I've mentioned with a green tinge, but what I've written about as what I call welfarist authoritarianism. In other words, the idea that collective economic good is a superior outcome to the individuated liberal self. The traditional liberal position would be, which I share, I hasten to add, is that these are not separable categories. But this vibe is not just Chinese. It's something that we're seeing more and more in many, many parts of the world, including in electoral democracies. And finally, the big question mark there, because all the rest obviously will come true, but this one I put a question mark just in case, is the division of the world into hemispheres of influence. I think on the one hand, it's very clear that, with the Iran war and, with some other examples, including a continued American presence in East Asia, we are not looking to a clear East-West division. But I think that we are clearly, at least for a while, in an environment where the United States will be spending more time thinking about its own hemisphere than perhaps has been the case in recent years. And as I've said, I think China's aim in the near future is to become the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. So a sort of hemispheric division by default, even if it's not necessarily a clear policy goal or in either case, is something that we should be looking to find out about. The one thing that I think it's fair to say is that the Trump-Xi relationship as it sits at the moment is definitely in a very fluid place. It's sometimes said that Donald Trump is the biggest China dove in his own administration. And whether or not you agree with that, it certainly provides, I think, a stimulating way to think about what might be different in that relationship and how Europeans and the global South can respond, which will certainly be a very turbulent period, but one in which a whole variety of previously geopolitically impossible thoughts may come to fruition. Will, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.